Recording with external microphone. System sound volume set to 100%.
Well, hello everyone. We are back again in this voice note number 8, and I'll begin this by clarifying about the use of the premise major and premise minor that I talked about in the previous note. So, you see, the correct, example is, please make correction, is that if P is not P, this is premise minor, and if P is not Q, this is premise minor, and if Q is not P, this is premise major. Then the conclusion is P is P. अगर P Q नहीं है और Q भी P नहीं है तो फिर P क्या है? P है. So in this way, the metaphysical poets give logic in their poem. Now, I have introduced the poem to you. I'll now read out the introduction to John Donne and then we'll start the poem. You see, his dates are given here. The dates are 1572 to 1631. John Donne was a representative poet of the metaphysical poets of his time. He set the metaphysical mode by vibrancy of language and startling imagery, and a preference for a diction modeled on direct utterances. He was brought up as a Roman Catholic. Later, he converted to Anglicanism and was Dean of St. Paul's Church till his death. Now, they tell us something about metaphysical poetry. The total effect of a metaphysical poem at its best is to startle the reader into seeing and knowing what he has not really noticed or thought about before. जी, ये बात सही है कि metaphysical poetry आपको वो सोचने पे मजबूर करेगी जो आपने किसी चीज़ के बारे में पहले सोचा नहीं. Like all Donne's poetry, this poem too reflects an emphasis on the intellect and wit as against feeling and emotion. Now, this point I have already clarified. To say that there's no feeling would be wrong, but the feelings are logically and intellectually presented in the poem. In fact, feeling and thought are fused. So let's start the poem now. Stand still and I'll read to thee a lecture, Love in Love's Philosophy. So the poet calls upon his beloved to stand still. Still here means both motionless and silent. That is all, carefree, tension-free, with an open mind. And the poet says that he's going to read or deliver or point out what is true love. He's going to deliver a lecture on love in love's philosophy. That is, he's going to explain the wisdom of love. Now, please be careful. Here, the poet takes one day as the symbol of the entire life of the lovers. So different stages of the day correspond to the different stages of life the entire life of the lovers. So here we go. These 3 hours that we have spent walking here, 2 shadows went, along with us, which we ourselves produced. So now he is talking of the morning. 3 hours, you know, may correspond to 3 years, initial years of the lover's life, or maybe, more than three. But in any case, it refers to the initial stage of the lover's life. Remember, shadows before noon symbolize the initial stages of love. The poet says that just as in the morning the shadows are produced, you know, uh, like as they have been walking, while walking they have produced two shadows. So, same is the case with the lovers. They themselves produce the shadows as they love each other. So, the shadows, in fact, symbolize the initial stages of love or the initial love. So, walking here, two shadows when this is the analogy, the comparison. As the lovers spend their lives, there is an initial stage. The love is in its initial stage, just as shadows before noon are smaller and darker. So these shadows in fact reflect the initial stages of love. But now the sun is just above our head. We do those shadows tread, and to brave clearness all things are reduced. But then, just as in case of a day, there comes a time which is noon, when the sun is at its highest, and what happens is that if you stand in a large field, and when the sun is at its highest at the time of noon, you would not be able to see any shadow. बिल्कुल उरूज के वक्त जब सन होता है तो कोई भी शैडो नहीं होती उस वक्त, किसी भी मैदान में आप खड़े होकर देख लें. सो to brave clearness all things are reduced. I have explained this phrase, brave clearness. Broad daylight, everything is reduced to broad daylight. Now broad daylight, there is no tinge of darkness anywhere. This time has come. So there comes a time in the lover's life when their love is at its best, at the zenith, highest point. अब वो टाइम कितने अरसे बाद आता है, कितने दिन रहता है, इससे कोई बहस नहीं, लेकिन एक पीरियड वो भी आता है. So there is an initial stage of love which is reflected by the morning shadows. Then there is the zenith of love, which is symbolized by noon. अब सवाल ये पैदा होता है कि इस नून के बाद क्या होगा. जैसा कि मैंने थीम में एक्सप्लेन किया था कि हर उरूज ज़वाल अस्त, हर उरूज का ज़वाल होता है. Will there be a decline or not? The poet will come to this. So whilst our infant loves did grow, disguises did. Now, infant loves here means initial loves, initial stages of love. Our initial love kept growing. That is why the disguises, the changed appearances of the shadows also, the shadows also kept growing and their appearances kept changing. बहुत अर्ली मॉर्निंग में शैडो स्मॉल और डार्क होती हैं. थोड़ा सा और टाइम गुजरता है, 10 बजता है, 11 बजता है, तो शैडोज़ थोड़ी लॉन्ग होने लगती हैं. तो ये डिस्गाइजेस चेंज होती रहती हैं नून तक. तो इनका मतलब ये है कि ये डिफरेंट शैडो, ये जो यानी अपीयरेंसेस चेंज हो रही हैं शैडो की, दिस शोज़ द ग्रोथ इन लव. So, and shadows kept flowing from us and our cares, because we cared for each other, we loved each other. So similarly the shadows kept flowing. जैसे कि shadow flow
Screen off.
करती रहती हैं, तो वो डिफरेंट स्टेजेस को रिफ्लेक्ट करती हैं. और वो डिफरेंट स्टेजेस क्या होती हैं? व्हाट आर दोज डिफरेंट स्टेजेस? दैट इज द लव इन फैक्ट कीप्स growing. The two, the lovers care for each other, they love each other, they sacrifice for each other, um, and so on. तो ये सब जैसा कि शेडोज़ में चेंजेस आते रहते हैं, ऐसे इनकी लाइफ में भी चेंजेस आते रहते हैं. But now it is not so. He says now it's not so. Now it may seem. अब ये कह रहा है कि अब ऐसा नहीं है. ऐसा नहीं है का मतलब ये नहीं है कि लव ख़त्म हो गया, बल्कि अब थोड़ी देर के लिए नून के वक्त हमें ऐसा महसूस होता है, when there is noon of life, when we are at the height of our life, when we are at the best of our life, we for a moment feel what next. अब क्या? अब तो ऐसा नहीं है. एक टाइम ऐसा आता है लवर्स की लाइफ में जब उन्हें लगता है कि ये जेनिथ है, इससे ज़्यादा तो अब हो ही नहीं सकता. और तो अब यहाँ से क्या होगा? क्या डिक्लाइन हो जाएगा या इंक्रीज होगा? क्या होगा? दैट द पोएट इज़ गोइंग टू फाइंड आउट. दैट लव हैथ नॉट अटेन द हाइएस्ट डिग्री which is still diligent lest others see. So he's trying to explain that look, although it seems that we have reached the noon of love, जैसे एक डे होता है उसमें नून आ जाता है तो हमें लगता है ये हाईएस्ट पॉइंट है, इसी तरह से लवर्स की लाइफ में एक पॉइंट आता है, उन्हें लगता है कि ये उनका हाईएस्ट पॉइंट है. बट to consider that the love had that love ever reaches the highest point is a mistake. Love never reaches its highest point. Why? As the poet will later explain, it always keeps growing. So why is love still diligent? Diligent, that is effective or persistent. Why it is still continuing? Lest others see, so that others may not make fun of the lovers. Now, you see, he's going to present conditions. Except our loves at this noon stay. Except may here means if. If our loves at this noon stay. This noon, that is the day that we are talking about. Or the lover's life. The noon of lover's life. If our love stays, यानी अगर लव में डिक्लाइन नहीं होता है तो एक कंडीशन ये हो गई. इफ़ P इज़ नॉट Q, एक कंडीशन ये हो गई. तो क्या होगा? We shall new shadows make the other way. The poet says that we will create new shadows and we will give new meanings to the shadows. As the first were made to blind others, the first shadows, the morning shadows, in fact blinded others, क्योंकि वो दूसरे के चेहरे पे पड़ती हैं तो उनके चेहरे पे अंधेरा आ जाता है. These which come behind will work upon ourselves and blind our eyes. अब देखिए, shadows आफ्टरनून जो है, आफ्टरनून में अगर आप शैडो देखें तो मॉर्निंग के कंपैरिजन में वो आपके पीछे गिरती है and it becomes less dark and long. So these shadows, in fact, the poet says, will blind us. That is, only the lovers will understand the meaning of these shadows. What the poet is trying to say is this. You see, shadows afternoon symbolize the decline not in love but in physical charm and beauty. So the poet says that if our love continues to exist, if we care for each other, even if we have no physical charm or attraction left, even then, if we care to, if we continue to care for each other, then only we will understand it. Others perhaps may not, but we will. The lovers will understand each other's feeling, and their love will keep on growing. हालांकि ये नून है, लेकिन नून के बाद से फिजिकल चार्म और ब्यूटी में डिक्लाइन हो जाता है. तो फिजिकल अट्रैक्टिवनेस कम होने का मतलब ये नहीं कि मोहब्बत कम हो गई. वो फिर दूसरे लोग चाहे समझे ना समझें, दोज हु लव ईच अदर दे डू अंडरस्टैंड. दिस इज पॉइंट वन. And then there is the second possibility. What is the second possibility? If our loves faint and westwardly decline. देखिए, पहले इसने कहा except, let me pick that line. Except our loves at this noon stay. एक तो condition ये है, if our love at this noon stay, then we will continue to love each other. Then the love will remain alive. एक पॉइंट तो ये हो गया. सेकेंड पॉइंट है, इफ द लव फेंट एंड westwardly decline. If it faints, if it becomes weaker, and like the sun, it declines. You know, the sun sets in the west, इसलिए westward decline. तो if P is not Q, ये पहली वाली कंडीशन थी एक्सेप्ट वाली. दूसरी वाली कंडीशन, इफ Q is not P, यानी एक कंडीशन ये थी कि लव डिक्लाइन नहीं करता है, तो क्या होगा? तो इट विल कीप ग्रोइंग. दूसरी कंडीशन ये कि इफ लव डिक्लाइंस, देन द रिजल्ट वुड बी टू मी thou falsely thine, you will not remain true to me, and I to thee mine actions shall disguise, and I too will hide my life, my actions from you. I too will not remain true to you. So both will become in fact disloyal to each other. That is, if the quality of love does not remain growing all the time, then the lovers do not remain true to each other. There may come a time in the lover's life, if the quality remains the same, they will continue to love each other. If the quality doesn't remain the same, if the quality of love doesn't keep growing, then they will become disloyal to each other. This will be the conclusion. Now he concludes, the morning shadows were away. So obviously there was an initial stages of love which came and went away, but these grow longer all the day. Obviously the shadows throughout the day keep growing longer. In other words, we have a beginning of lover's life, and then the time keeps passing, they lose physical charm and strength also. All these things keep occurring. But then he explained, but oh, love's day is short if love decay. Remember, he says, love's day is short. The moment it starts decaying, the day is over. उससे कोई मतलब नहीं है कि ये noon है या afternoon है या morning है. The moment it decays, that is the end of love. As the last two lines tells us, love is a growing or full constant light, and his first minute after noon is night. So love is defined as growing and full constant light which remains the same all the time, but then keeps on growing in intensity. In other words, I have explained it, that the passion of love always remains the same, and it keeps on growing in intensity. I've given you that example of a bulb earlier on, so I'll not repeat it here. So he says that if this light is, not constant, if there is a decline in love, then he says his first minute afternoon is night. So there is nothing like afternoon in love. At the time of noon, two things may happen. Either the lovers will continue loving each other and the love will keep growing, and if it declines, then there is the end of the day of love. And what we have after the day, we have night. So that is the night of love. That is the end of love or the death of love, you see. तो इसको मैं आपको थोड़ा सा हिंदी में भी बता देता हूँ, कुछ थोड़ा सा डिफ़िकल्ट आपको ना लगे. देखिए, एक दिन को लवर्स की पूरी ज़िंदगी से कंपेयर किया गया है. जिस तरह से इनिशियल लव होता है तो वो मॉर्निंग शैडोज़ से कंपेयर किया गया है. जैसे मॉर्निंग में शैडोज़ डार्क होती हैं और छोटी होती हैं, तो वो इनिशियल स्टेजेस होती रहती हैं. उसके बाद जिस तरह से नून आता है, सन अपने हाईएस्ट पॉइंट पे होता है, ऐसे ही लवर्स की ज़िंदगी में एक टाइम आता है जब उन्हें महसूस होता है कि अब ये द लव इज़ एट इट्स बेस्ट क्वालिटी. लेकिन पोइट का ये कहना है कि लव कभी भी अपनी बेस्ट क्वालिटी अचीव नहीं करता. हाँ, लवर्स एक दूसरे की केयर करते रहते हैं ताकि दूसरे भी उन्हें गलत ना समझें. और वो ट्रू जेन्युइन लव इज़ नॉट कन्फाइंड टू फिज़िकल ब्यूटी या फिज़िकल चार्म. वो फिज़िकल चार्म ख़त्म होने के बाद भी जो जेन्युइन लव है वो ग्रो करता रहता है. अब नून पे जहाँ पे हमें लगता है कि ये हाईएस्ट पॉइंट है, वहाँ से दो पॉसिबिलिटीज़ हैं. एक पॉसिबिलिटी तो ये है कि लव जो है वो ग्रो करता रहे, तो उस सूरत में द लवर्स विल एक्सपीरियंस न्यू फीलिंग्स फ्रॉम ईच अदर. दूसरी कंडीशन ये है कि इफ़ लव फेंट्स, अगर कोई डिक्लाइन होता है, तो फिर द लवर्स विल नॉट रिमेन ट्रू टू ईच अदर. और कंक्लूजन ये है कि लव स्टेज शॉर्ट. लव डे में या लवर्स की लाइफ में आफ्टरनून या इवनिंग की नाम की कोई चीज़ नहीं होती. लव ऑलवेज रिमेन्स एट इट्स बेस्ट, एट इट्स हाईएस्ट, सीमिंगली. इसको डिफ़ाइन किया गया फुल कांस्टेंट ग्रोइंग एंड फुल कांस्टेंट लाइट है. ऐसे ही लव, जेन्युइन लव होता है. अगर जैसे कि लाइट में थोड़ा सा भी डिक्लाइन हुआ तो नून ख़त्म हो जाता है. यू नो, जैसे ही सन थोड़ा सा ढलना शुरू हुआ, नून ख़त्म हो जाता है. फिर हम कहते हैं आफ्टरनून. तो इसी तरह से यू नो, इफ़ देयर इज़ अ डिक्लाइन इन लव, अगर हमने ये महसूस कर लिया कि हाँ भाई अब तो ये तो हाईएस्ट पॉइंट है, इससे ज़्यादा हो नहीं सकता, ये जब हमने महसूस कर लिया तो इसका मतलब अब डिक्लाइन है, और डिक्लाइन इज़ इक्वल टू डेथ ऑफ लव. There is no love. So genuine love, remember, is like full constant light, growing or full constant light. Let me now quickly run through the questions. How do shadows before noon differ from shadows after noon? It's quite clear. The shadows before noon are smaller and darker, and shadows after noon are longer and less dark. What do the two kinds of shadows represent? The morning shadows represent the initial stages of the lover's life, whereas the shadows afternoon represent a decline in physical charm, beauty and attractiveness. Then the next question is, love is described as light. What makes the poet talk about shadows? Well, love is described light, but the poet brings in shadow in order to establish a contrast between light and shadow, and this helps him, you know, establish the conceit, the comparison between love and light, and define love as growing and full constant light. Then they say comment on the use of the image of shadows for the idea that the poet wants to convey. We have already seen that morning shadows in fact represent initial stages of love, and shadows afternoon in fact represent the decline in physical charm and beauty. So the idea is that shadow has nothing to do with love. As opposed to this, its opposite, that is light. You know, love is described in terms of light, not in terms of shadows, and the two are contrasted. The shadow may be longer or shorter, the shadow may decline, the shadow may become darker or less dark. But in case of love, there's nothing like that. The love always keeps growing. It's like growing light, and the light which is full and constant. So, in order to establish this contrast, the shadows are brought. The poet seems to be addressing his beloved in the poem. What is the message he wishes to convey to her? You see, the main point of the message is, although the entire theme is the message, but the main point of the message is that genuine love never declines, and that in genuine love there is nothing. Although in genuine love, you always have noon, you never have afternoon, evening, because if there is a slight decline, that is the end of love. So genuine love is like growing full constant light. Then, instead of a lecture upon love, the poet calls the poem a lecture upon shadows, a lecture upon the shadow. What is the effect that this has on our reading of the poem? Well, it does influence our reading. As I told you earlier, Harry called it a lecture upon love. We would perhaps have not given any importance to it because there are hundreds and thousands of love poems. But he calls it a lecture upon the shadow, and it catches our eye, catches our attention, and we read the poem and we discover that, well, ऐसा आइडिया, ऐसा घिसा पिटा आइडिया, मोहब्बत मोहब्बत मोहब्बत, कितने ही पोइट्स ने इसके बारे में बात की है, लेकिन दिस पोएम इज़ वेरी डिफरेंट फ्रॉम अदर love poems. Here everything is defined logically, and the poet has a clear message. So it has an effect on our reading of the poem. It surprises us, it includes an element of surprise, and it delights us. Then here in language work, they draw our attention to the fact that the final E that was used in Dunn's time was dropped from English orthography, that is English spellings, in several words in the poem, like clearness, behind, shadows, sun, noon, and hours. The final E is used. So they've quoted several lines from some other examples from some other poets, which is, when you get the book, you can go through it. I'll read the line for you. How neatly do, DOE, we give one only name, ONELY, name, to parents issue, and the sun's bright star. Star also has a final E, and parents issue, apostrophe is dropped. Suns, bright stars, apostrophe is dropped. In our poem, love's philosophy is used without apostrophe. Then they ask you to explain the meanings of two adjectives, infant loves and brave clearness, in isolation and as part of the phrases. We have discussed both these in great detail. So this completes the poem. Well, dear student, This also completes our assignment until 15th May. We have thoroughly discussed, I repeat, the introduction to English poetry, then understanding the poetry, then we have covered vocabulary, theme, and metaphysical poetry. I've given you notes and I've discussed them as well. Then I've introduced the poem to you and I have done the text also at length. So poem 1 is finished along with questions, and I've given you the answers as well. Now you read it. If you have any company, try to discuss answers with your friends and write them down. I've given my number. You can find it in the description of the audio. And if you have if you have any difficulties, call me and take appointment, and I'll address your problems at the appointed time. So as far as elective English is concerned, as far as our assignment in elective English is concerned, it's over. Let's hope we are able to meet for classroom teaching after July, and then we'll continue with the next poem in our course. In fact, we'll continue with Blake. The other poet, Milton, I told you earlier, would be done by some other teacher. So let's hope that. And I'm not so sure, but perhaps I'll be meeting you for core course also. Let's see, that we'll decide in time. But for the time being, this is the last voice note that I'm giving you. And so keep fit and fine, take care, and let's hope, let's pray that Allah Almighty may set things right and once again put the world back on its track, and the regular life resumes, and we are able to we may be able to meet again as we used to do in our schools, in classrooms, you see. Ameen. And so for the time being, until we meet for the core course, let's see. Once again, keep fit and fine. It's goodbye from me.
Device unlocked. Pause button.